Hey Kings, and welcome back to the Augustus Maximus channel, and welcome to the top 5 worst focus trees in Hearts of Iron 4. And the premise is relatively simple, of course. We'll be going over the worst stinkers, the absolute trash, the garbage that can be found within the focus trees of Hearts of Iron 4. Now, there have been many videos like this. However, a lot of them are actually relatively old, so I thought I'd go over some of the newer focus trees and focus tree paths that have been added in, well, the last 2 to 3 DLCs and the various updates, and we'll take a look at the worst performing focus tree paths that are out there and that can be played and that have been, for some reason, decided upon by the developers to be added into the game, even though they're completely trashy. Alright, starting off with number 5, it's France. And France has a really good focus tree. I mean, it has one of the best focus trees, ignoring that air focus right there. It has one of the best focus trees in the game right now for any sort of major power. However, there is one really big stinker, and it's the Little Entente over here. Now you might be wondering, why would this be such a bad path? Because you clearly gain your own alliance, you don't have to rely on Britain, it's sort of a democratic alternative to the Allies. If you're playing non-historically, it's one of the only democratic paths available to you. However, let's take a look actually at this little path here. So you have to do all of this, ending with the invest in our weaker allies, because the coordinate rearmament doesn't actually do that much. But investing our weaker allies is essentially the end. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 70-day focuses, bringing the war forward to 1938, because you have to defend Czechoslovakia. Well, you don't have to, but it's, you know, if you go for the Little Entente, it's sort of an understanding that you're gonna go and protect Czechoslovakia. Meaning it takes a really long time to get this alliance, the Little Entente, actually going. And invest in our weaker allies is kind of a necessity, because all of these guys individually don't necessarily have the best industry, and so invest in our weaker allies does boost them up quite a bit. And if they actually capitulate, do gain the military factories that they would gain from the invest in our weaker allies. However, not only does it take so long that you have to ignore your military focus tree and your industrial focus tree and your naval focus tree and your aerial focus tree, which isn't actually that bad to ignore, to be completely honest, but you also have to get rid of the disjointed government, and you should get rid of the victors of the Great War. Now that's all possible if you go with Britain. However, it's not all that possible if you have to invest such a long time into bringing up the Little Entente, and then moving the war forward an entire year. So that's one big issue. The other issue is that if you've ever played with the Little Entente, you know exactly what's going to happen. The Germans declared war in 38 over the Sudetenland. Everybody jumps in to protect Czechoslovakia. Obviously, that's great. Yugoslavia immediately starts pushing into Austria. However, it's all looking great. However, Croatia pops up. Croatia pops up, completely encircling the entire Yugoslav and Romanian army in this little pocket right here in Austria and Slovenia. The Germans sweep in, completely annihilate the entire Yugoslav army, half the Romanian army, and they just sweep across here. Czechoslovakia now faces a siege from 2 sides, sweep across there. In 6 months, everyone's dead. And because you haven't done any any army focuses or industrial focuses, you're barely keeping on. You can maybe push towards Mosseland, or you may be able to even capture a little bit into Württemberg, these 2 provinces right here. But because the West Wall is actually really powerful, and you haven't really done anything when it comes to industry or army or anything like that, you're screwed. You're completely screwed out of the entire alliance here. Now you do gain 6 military factories from that, but it's not actually all that great, and soon Italy is going to be joining in, so you might as well defend Savoy, you might as well pull back to the Maginot Line, and you also have to worry about Belgium being punched through very soon. You also have to worry about Africa, as you're just playing a standard France game. It's the same as if you went with Britain, except it takes so much longer, and you have to ignore these focuses right here, meaning you're going to be lacking that focus, you're going to be lacking that research slot, you're going to be lacking the doctrines, you're going to be lacking a whole bunch of stuff. It's not that great. That is especially true if you take into consideration the direct alternative, which is the Stresa front. The Straits of Front takes 1, 2, 3, 4 focuses to complete, all of them in 70 days, of course. You not only gain a major power as an ally, or you bring them into the allies essentially, also deny a major ally from the Germans. Now you might say the Italians aren't actually that bad when it comes to fighting them, and that's true, that's completely true. However, it means that you don't have to worry about Africa, it means that you don't have to worry about the Navy, it means that you don't have to worry about Savoy, and it means that the Germans are under pressure in Austria. Because of the modifier the Italians have, Vittoria Mutilata, AI modifier focus on offense plus 50%. They simply push them more, they simply always ram their face into the Alps. And to be granted, they do get pushed a tiny bit sometimes, but because it's the Alps you can easily bail them out by just defending this little region right here. And with like 10 divisions, and it's not really all that terrible. So, the Straits of Front, if you want to play sort of your own... Alright, moving on to number 4 with Spain, more specifically, strictly democratic Republican Spain. Now, it's not actually that bad when it comes to the Civil War. The Civil War is sort of your relatively standard stuff. You do get the, some research here, you do get some forts, a research slot, which is really nice. You do gain the petition, the French for aid, which never goes through. And you do gain some advisors, political powers, a few more divisions, just to make things a little bit easier. But the Republican side is inherently going to be a little more difficult than the United Nationalist Front, obviously. But, speaking strictly of the democratic path, we have to take a look at this little focus tree right here. So let's take a look at the great bonuses that you get for going strictly democratic. So you have reprofessionalize the army. Some recruitable population, that's really good because obviously you want manpower. You have some land doctrine and some army XP, and that's really good. You have some planning speed, that's really good. And then, wait, you have to do expand the naval academy. You have to do the naval stuff. You absolutely have to focus on your navy before you can do anything. Before there's any sort of payoff, you have to focus on your navy. Now, isn't that a little bit strange? Isn't that a little bit strange? And you can't really do any of this because this means you're gonna go with the communists. This is meant for once you become a puppet of the Soviets, you have to do this stuff, and then ultimately war for independence. Isn't it a little bit strange? Isn't it a little bit strange that, well, you would have to do the naval stuff. You absolutely have to do the naval stuff, and that's a big oof, because if you actually take a look at the navy, the navy that the Spanish possess, it's not actually all that great. It really isn't. And what it's more to say that even their like battleships, they're basically the earliest and the weakest battleships that you can get. They're really not that great. There's some decent stuff here, but why would they want you to go for the navy? Isn't that a little bit strange? Because thinking about it, your ultimate role as a Spain player, you go democratic Spain, Germany takes over France, you manage to somehow restore somewhat of an industry, barely keeping it together. Your ultimate goal, as even these focuses later on suggest, you should be taking out Germany. Now, how are naval focuses exactly going to help with that? Because by the time you enter the war, the Italian Navy's been effectively crippled by the British Navy in the Mediterranean. The African front essentially has been resolved already, usually let's say 1940. And it's just a little bit strange. Why would they want you to go for the naval stuff? Well, I have a theory that they want for you to go and fight Japan. But that's just a speculation, but you have to do the naval stuff to move on. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, prepare for the next war. You gain some land doctrines, and you gain war support. That's relatively decent. Wartime industry, some good stuff, but you have to be at war. So before you even gain some actual bonuses, you have to be at war. But obviously you'd want to build up your military before you go to war, right? Isn't that sort of a natural given, And then you get some excavation, interesting. You have a focus to go against the Germans, which is sort of, I think I would just join the Allies. Button right here would have been sufficient, but okay. And then you gain plus 10% attack. Wow! As the final focus, as the big payoff, the giant payoff for strictly democratic Republican Spain, plus 10% attack. Now, let me just look over the alternatives. Okay, so as the anarchist, you get to core the entire world, essentially. You have the option to do that. As the communist, you have a giant industrial buff here, not to mention you have a giant red bear as your ally. If you want to go and look at the nationalists, if you go with Franco, you can also go democratic, actually, and let's look at this payoff. Okay, you have industry immediately, industry immediately, industry immediately, industry immediately, no war required for this, by the way. And the the naval stuff is off to the side. You have Francisco Franco as an insanely good country leader. You gain a lot of research stuff, you have a lot of industrial stuff, you can do autarky, which means that you can essentially completely annihilate the recovering from the Civil War focus in like 1938, 1939. And you have the strongest army when it comes to stats ever, looking at the Carlists, and you essentially get to puppet the entirety of Central America and the Caribbean. So, what exactly is the payoff for doing the Republicans? 10% attack. Okay, well, look, isn't that a bit weak? Isn't that just a little bit really weak? Isn't that just completely insane? I mean, granted, it's basically the easy... No, it's not the easiest. It's the second easiest side when it comes to Republicans. However, the alternative is going with the Stalinists. Yeah, the Stalinist doctrine. And that one gives you immediately 3% recruitable population, gives you a lot of stuff here. You can become a puppet here, but that's not really necessary, is it? Because you can clearly just wipe the anarchist here fairly easily, and then you can just focus down the individual threats that the nationalists have. It's actually quite easy, and if you manage to hold these two regions right here, the nationalists are gonna break apart anyway. So it's completely brainless almost. And your big payoff, if you stick with the Democrats... Alright, moving on to number 3, it is the Kingdom of Greece. And more specifically, because the Kingdom of Greece is, well, it's one of the newest focus trees, really. And it's a little bit divisive. However, there is clearly the worst path. Out of all of these, there is one clearly worst path available, and it's just completely trashy. And that is the right to rule path. Which is a shame, because obviously it's the monarchist path, and people really like the monarchist paths, but the Greek monarchist path is, well, it really sucks. So let's take a look at these individual focuses. The right to rule, you enter into a civil war, you get King George II, and it's, well, it's not strictly terrible. He isn't the worst country leader. He's a divisive absolute monarch. He lowers your stability by 10%. However, he does make your political advisor and your high command and everything like that 15% cheaper. So it's actually not that terrible. And strictly speaking, it's actually faster to go down this path and down this path, obviously, because you only have to do 2 focuses, and one of them is only a 35-day focus, meaning you can focus on your army, you can focus on your industry here, you can do a whole lot of stuff there. So, from that point of view, you're an entire focus and a half ahead, essentially. And that's actually quite good, because time is... you know, being ahead of your enemies when it comes to focuses, industry, army, and everything like that is a really good thing, obviously. However, let's move down the focus tree path. So, crack down on the Republicans. You obviously have to do that whether you go with Metaxism or not. Or the right to rule. Both of them have to do crack down on the Republicans, which is, well, that's just a thing you have to do. Then, use the military is the only option you have when you go with the right to rule. You don't have access to any sort of fascist path, so it's, well, we're not gonna have a fascist monarchy, we only have a monarchy. However, the one big thing that Metaxism is going for, which is the historical path, is the Metaxism path, right here, the Orthodox state, everything like that, which gives you -5 consumer goods, +10 stability, +10 war support, +5 war support, defense, and then recruitable population, everything like that. Which is actually really good. All of these focuses, because Italy is going to declare war on you. Let's go with the historical path right here. Italy is going to declare war on you, and having all of those core defense buffs and war support and stability and the industrial buff right here, it's going to make it so much easier to build forts, for example, to defend on your defend right here, And when it comes to Albania, to defend here and here if Bulgaria decides, or when Bulgaria decides to join, or if you want to shorten the front, maybe it's going to make it easier to defend right here in the hills and everything like that. Defending this little area right here is going to be insanely easy if you have plus 10% defense on core territory, if you have more industry and everything like that. The King George II has nothing. He has nothing here. There is no like royal path down here. Everything that's here can also be done with the metaxism path. Everything, except for realign ourselves the Central Powers. So if Germany if Germany under whatever circumstance happens to go down this little focus tree here and revive the Kaiserreich, this little path right here, you have a button that asks the Central Powers to join them, and then you can gain a war goal against Turkey. And I'm not, strictly speaking, this isn't terrible. It's not terrible. However, this is the only payoff that you get. You get to request to join the Central Powers. Isn't that insanely weak? This is the only payoff. This is the only... Austria-Hungary or the Kaiserreich must exist. So, whether the Hungarians or the Germans decide to go down a specific focus tree which is non-historical, only then can you realign yourself. Only then can you actually have some sort of payoff. So, it's basically a roleplay focus tree. This entire path is just a roleplay focus tree. It doesn't give you any buffs. It gives you essentially nothing. All it does is request for the Central Powers for you to join. And then you can gain a war goal against Turkey, but at that point Turkey is going to be guaranteed by Britain and Germany. Or Britain or Germany, or maybe none of them if you're very quick about this, but it's... there's no point to doing this. There's absolutely no point. And I'm going to propose an alternative path that is in the game, and it should have been used right here. It should have been used right here. And that is the Turkish Balkan Entente path, right here. Right here. It's in the game. It's right here. Turkey, I'm sorry to say, but it's out of the way. It's clearly out of the way. It has basically no business. I'm not saying it has no business being there. But why is it here? Turkey has so many options right here. You can go with the Axis, you can go with the Germans or the Italians, you can go with the British, you can go with the Soviets, you can go the Ottoman path. This Balkan Entente thing right here, the Balkan Entente path, should have been right here. Should have been right here because it would make so much sense, right? Because there's so many rivalries in the Balkans. However, having this sort of king that's a divisive monarch eventually unite, this sort of path of progress for this monarch who starts off as a divisive monarch. He eventually unites all of the Balkans and helps to defend against the Italians and the Germans. That's such a good story. That's such a good roleplay story on its own, and it would fix this little just nothingness right here. There's no payoff right now, and having at least this. Because if you take a look at these individual focuses, it would kind of make sense for Greece to have them, right? You have the Balkan Pact, which is sort of a historical Greek thing. You have a division. You have a defense on core territory. You have some industrial bonuses right here. You have free trade, industrial bonuses. You have change in popularity of democracy or unaligned for the Balkan Pact. So it does make sense that a sort of a monarchy would go for this sort of stuff instead of a sort of a more fascist-aligned dictatorship or anything like that. Sort of as an alternative to the Metaxa paths right here. You could have had the Balkan path right there. So it's really a big shame. Alright, moving back to Spain with number 2, and the worst Spanish focus tree path is hinder the NKVD interference, which is the independent communist path. It's an alternative to the Stalinist doctrine. It's an independent communist path, and it's terrible. It's terrible because it provides nothing. It provides nothing when it comes to either being an independent communist or being an alternative to the Republican tree. there's absolutely nothing that's going on here, because the direct rivalry here is the anarchists, and they can essentially core the entire world, which is incredibly overpowered. It's also a lot of fun to play with that. However, the independent communists, they do gain exactly a lot of research stuff. You do gain the land doctrines, recruitable population, land doctrines, air doctrines, infantry, artillery, and then war goals, and they do gain a lot of research stuff right here. That's good, and that's really good. However, the ultimate payoff, you always have to keep this in mind. What is the payoff? And let's compare to the alternative paths for this nation or of a similar nation. Let's look at the ultimate payoff. Unify the London Bureau. Invite Paraguay. Now, I'm not entirely sure if you know this, but Paraguay is landlocked. They're a small country, they have 2 provinces, and they have a very lackluster industry. And so, again, what exactly is the point? The ultimate focuses have a focus against the German Reich and against the Soviet Union. So you do have a lot of focuses here. You do have some, obviously, the dockyard stuff. You do have some industrial bonuses here. It's all nice and good. And then you can create your own alliance and invite Paraguay. Well, even that 10% attack actually sounds really nice. But invite Paraguay. Like, how terrible is that? Invite Paraguay, you create your own little faction and invite Paraguay. Okay. Really nice, really nice. Now let's take a look at an alternative path. We already taken a look at the anarchists, or, spoke about them, but let's take a look at a very, very, very similar path that Portugal has, which is essentially, again, independent communists. Okay, workers of Iberia unite, you enter into the civil war, you enter into your own civil war, you essentially join the Republican side. It's a lot of fun. It's very difficult, but it's a lot of fun. And the independent communist path for the Spanish is also really difficult, but it's a lot of fun. And then the Iberian Socialist Union, you essentially create a mega country. You create a union, the Iberian Socialist Union gets all of the Spanish cores, everything like that. It's absolutely brilliant. The Popular Front bloc, you do gain communism rising in Germany and France, potentially leading into a revolution if you're good enough, and also you use your spies a little bit. And then Latin American communism. All of these countries right there get a whole lot of communist support. A lot of communist support, and our comrades overseas, again, you get to invite Paraguay, but also because of all of these this focus right here, you get to flip essentially all of South America, or at least a lot of South America, communist. It's very similar to the Mexican path, right? Where was it? It was the Bolivar Alliance, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, the Bolivarian Alliance, which all of them gain communist support. Somewhere around here, pretty sure. Yeah, somewhere around here. This path essentially gives all of the South American countries a lot of communist support, and it's the same deal with the Portuguese tree right here, the Latin American communism. Even Central America, so Central and South America, the Latin American countries essentially gain a whole lot of communist support, and because they flip so quickly, you can then invite them to your alliance, and because you've united with Spain, you can then take on whoever you want, and you have a really, well, it's not a really powerful alliance, but it's actually relatively strong. If you look at this, it's really difficult to conquer all of them. And so, that is a direct comparison to just inviting Paraguay. And finally, the number 1 worst focus tree path in recent memory is the communist path for the United Kingdom, alongside the decolonization path. So let's start off with the decolonization path. Now, what are the bonuses? You obviously do gain a little bit of communist support if you're going for the communist path, which usually, well, you have to do because of the civil war that's gonna start. But the benefits essentially are that you gain a whole bunch of manpower, because now you don't have to technically govern all these individual areas. And you also gain a whole bunch of political power, which is sort of a moot point, and we'll get to that in a bit. But it's not exactly all that great, because one of the biggest strengths of playing as, or within the British Empire, but as the United Kingdom in general, is the extremely nice positioning power that you have, the geopolitical power plays that you can make, as the United Kingdom is infinitely increased, the probability that you will win and your power and everything like that because of power projection. You can essentially fight anywhere in the world you want because of all the colonies, because of all the dominions, because of the British Raj, because of the the dominions and everything. You can fight in Europe because of the, United Kingdom itself, but you can fight in Africa with a much better positioning than, for example, Italy. You can fight in Asia because of Raj, and you can fight in the Pacific theater because of Australia, New Zealand, British Malaya, Hong Kong, everything like that. You can even fight in America because of obviously Canada and the various holdings that you have throughout the Caribbean. So losing access to all of this stuff and gaining back a whole bunch of manpower and political power really isn't that great of a trade-off, especially if you take into consideration that the Dominions actually benefit much more from decolonization than you do. You essentially gain, nothing. You gain essentially nothing, and you also lose a core state in Northern Ireland, which is actually a decent state, not just because it allows you to, take control of Ireland potentially, but also because of it actually does have some starting factories. So you actually lose out on quite a bit of industry because you no longer gain access to obviously the industrial power of your empire, the resources, and the industrial power of your dominions and puppets and everything like that. So it's a really, really, really big downside. You also lose a whole bunch of stability here and here, and in general it's just not a good thing, but it's necessary to do for the communistry. So you'd expect that there would be some grand payoff. Well, you do have the concessions to the trade unions, obviously, which you have to do. And it takes a long, long time before you can actually flip communist if you go down the communist path. It takes roughly 2 to 3 years to actually flip to communist, which is insane, which is an insanely long time, and all of that time you'll just be spending political power like there's no tomorrow. And it's generally going to hurt your industrial output, it's going to hurt your army, it's going to hurt everything. Your factory output, your factory is going to be lacking, your political power is going to be in the dumpster, you'll have no advisors really selected, and your army is going to go in the trash as well, because, you don't really want to fight at any point during either decolonization or even turning communist, because, you're going to lose the political power gain. You're not really going to be able to defend the individual puppets once they become free. Your country, your armies that are present within, for example, Tanganyika, they're going to get exiled, and it's going to mess up the war in more ways than one, and it's just going to be terrible. So you're essentially just watching a sort of a map simulation. You're playing on Drew Journal mode when you actually go down the concessions to the trade unions, and even when you're trying to rush down the communist advisors and everything like that, which you actually can't take right off the bat. You have to be communist to take the communist revolutionary and George Orwell. So it's going to take quite a while. The only real amount of communist support you're going to gain is from a changing course and then banning fascism, meaning your stability is going to be in the dumpster. And your political power is going to be in the dumpster, everything like that. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at the benefits that you're actually going to get. Well, the fate of the royal family. Of course, this is in 1939 before we're even able to take this. So, the fate of the royal family. It does give you some political power, and it does give you some industrial output right off the bat, which is nice. It's a nice way to start this entire situation. Then we have eliminate the upper class, and this is truly a terrible focus, because not only do you remove quite a lot of these, quite a lot of your advisors. For example, you won't have access to the army regrouping guy, and you won't have access to the amphibious assault genius. You also won't have access to, these two, the army offense and the army maneuver people. You do have access to the army defense guy, but it's actually not that brilliant because you're on an island, and the defensive bonuses aren't actually going to be that great if you want to, for example, invade into France, invade into Germany, or just wherever. So it's it's a little bit of a nice boon if you want to play as a defensive with the defense expert, but of course it's much better to have a variety of options. And then you have For the Good of the Revolution, which does essentially remove the war to end all wars modifier, which is absolutely terrible. Does reduce your population factor, recruitable population factor, and it does also reduce the amount of consumer good factories, -5%, which is relatively decent. But remember, it's 1939, 1940. And let's just imagine what the state of the world is going to look like. So, if you go a changing course right off the bat, France is inevitably not going to go strictly communist or fascist or monarchist or anything like that. They're more likely they're not going to go with the Little Entente, meaning they're going to protect Czechoslovakia, meaning Germans are going to just roll over both of these countries, and France is going to be fully annexed. France is essentially going to be Germany. Czechoslovakia is going to be Germany anyway. The Low Countries are going to be Germany, and half of Africa is just going to be the Axis, and you'll have no hold over Africa whatsoever, because obviously you're decolonized. And this entire region is going to be dominated by the Axis anyway. Your only real hope is that the Japanese get into a bout with the Axis, but that's a long way off. So it's really not a good position to be in. It's really not a good position to be in during this stage. The actual advisor that you do gain for going communist is the Sylvia Pankhurst, the Red Suffragette, which does give you +2 recruitable population, which essentially just makes up for the lost army potential army that you could actually gain from your dominions, and especially India. So it doesn't really make up for it at all. It's sort of just a little bit of a softer landing. But she also obviously reduces your stability, which is absolutely wonderful. And then you have George Orwell, who does increase as communism support, meaning stability is a little bit better, does also improve war support. But this guy would have been much better off if he was available from the get-go, or even Harry Pollitt would have been better if he was available from the get-go. And all of the other ones don't necessarily matter that much. They're available just. You also don't have access to the silent workers, obviously, but that's sort of a given since you want a changing course. Now, here we go, the big payoff that we are supposed to get. This is the big payoff situation right here. So you have two options. Either go with Stalin, Mr. Moscow. So, you can go against the Germans, who do have a little bit of an attack and defense bonus against them. You do have a little bit of a transport and marine technology boost, and then you have a focus goal against them, a puppet focus war goal against the German Reich. And then the big payoff. The big payoff is factory output +10% and dockyard output +10%. And that's really not that great. This is the big payoff, just a little bit of a, better industrial situation. But not actually, because your industry is going to be in tatters after you do the decolonization path, because obviously you lose quite a lot of building slots, a lot of resources, a lot of puppets, a lot of the industry within those puppets and everything like that. So it's really not a great situation at all, and this is it makes up for it very, 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 very slightly, so it's not that great. You can also go against the Americans if you go follow Moscow, and you do gain the research bonuses when you actually join the Comintern. However, the war goal against the United States, it's sort of a moot point, because it's 1941 when you're going to be taking that, meaning Germany is going to go on its wild ride in Barbarossa. So if you actually do decide to join the Comintern, it's going to be a little bit strange to then go from Bermuda into the Americas, which is, by the way, also a really tough fight, since you have to control the airspace and the naval space within these three regions. And that's going to be really difficult in 1941. So this is all kind of a moot point. So let's take a look at the alternative, the British Communist alternative. Okay, reach out across the channel. So if either France or the Low Countries are communist, they're going to join you. Then a war goal against the Soviets, a war goal against the Germans again, and this one is always the payoff. The spirit of the Industrial Revolution is the big payoff for the entire communist tree, no matter who you go with. And enforced decolonization, well, if you actually take into consideration that France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and all of them are going to be basically controlled by the Axis, you're just going to get war goals against the Axis, so it doesn't really matter. Soviet cooperation doesn't make sense, because you should have just gone with follow Moscow anyway. So, the big question is that Obviously, this isn't completely terrible, but let's take a direct comparison with, for example, reinforce the empire. You have more stability, more research speed, you have more industry here, you ultimately have the Imperial Federation, you have a little bit of an option to gain more forts here. You do have the ability to essentially fortify whichever region you want. You also get war goals here. You also get a chance to essentially coerce either Greece or Turkey, meaning to expand the allies. The Greeks are usually going to join the allies anyway, and Turkey does ultimately in the late game as well, but it does give you options to go for it a little bit earlier. You also have the options to influence Spain, and you do have the option to influence the Balkans, everything like that. Just a whole variety of stuff going on here. And the alternative when it comes to decolonization is just giving up the entire empire for a little bit of manpower. It's really not that great. It's really not that great, and as a proposed alternative to the decolonization path, I think I would have stuck it somewhere around here. Somewhere in the middle here, you would have the decolonization option, and it would have been nice to maybe get actually some sort of benefit out of decolonization. Let's say that the British communist alternative decolonization tree would have allowed you to annex and core one of the dominions. Let's say you choose, I don't know, like the Western Hemisphere focus. So you do have an option to puppet and core and annex Ireland, and you do have an option to annex and core the Dominion of Canada. Sort of a, communist coup and the Western Anglosphere. Then you would have an option, for example, in the Pacific to annex and core Australia and New Zealand, just sort of as some sort of a boon to your industry and manpower and everything like that. Just a little bit of an option, like, yeah, we are decolonizing, but let's spread the revolution a little bit, because it doesn't really make sense to decolonize and then just ignore those countries, right? And also South Africa could have been an interesting option. And as an alternative to that, the Moscow path should have allowed you to essentially mimic the Soviet Union and essentially like Sovietize, unionize, whatever you want to call it. Basically just core all of these little holdings that you have. So you ignore the dominions, and instead of that, you essentially core all of these, like British Guiana, all of the essentially occupied states, the colonial states, whatever you want to call them. So not the puppet regions, but the regions that you control directly. You would have an option to annex them and get rid of the dominions. So instead of so as an alternative to the Imperial Federation, where you essentially core all of the dominions and you annexed India, you would have an option to core and annex, for example, 2 puppets or 2 former colonies or 2 dominions, something like that. And when it comes to the Moscow path, you essentially try to recreate sort of a British Soviet Union, whatever you want to call it, and allows you to core all of Africa, for example, which actually isn't that powerful, because these states by themselves are relatively weak. There isn't all that much in them. You do have a little bit of rubber here and there, a little bit of chromium, and some oil right here. So there isn't a whole lot of stuff going on within the colonies. But it would serve as sort of this big payoff, because at this point in time, the big payoff is that you gain some war goals and you do have like 10% more factory output. So that's really terrible. It's really terrible, and you also have to take into consideration what sort of alternative is there. Well, you have the monarchist path, which is absolutely wonderful. You do have some really good advisors there. You have an opportunity to ally with the Axis. You have an opportunity to gain imperial conscription, and the sun never sets, which are some really good bonuses right there. Unite the Anglosphere. You get to core essentially a whole lot of stuff. You gain the opportunity to have a very radical ideology, and at the same time retake all of your lost land. So there's a bit of a quest going on when it comes to the black shirts. You do gain some very good industrial bonuses early on, and it does allow you to keep some of the dominions alongside, very similar to the communist side, but this is a very moot point if you actually do decolonization and take move to secure the dominions. Because of guide the colonies, they also gain a whole bunch of independence, so it doesn't really matter anyway. So the only real option, the only real sort of like interesting option that you can have while playing a communist Britain is to first lend lease a whole bunch of stuff to Canada or South Africa is a bit of a bit of a special situation, but for example, the British Raj or Canada or someone from here, you essentially lend-lease them a whole bunch of stuff, then you annex them, then you do decolonization, and you get to keep the annexed land of the former puppet, meaning you do have a little bit of an option when it comes to expansion, for example, in Asia, to gain more manpower, more industry, everything like that. Sort of restart imperialism, but under a different banner. So, yeah, that's the worst. This is the worst path. And it's not strictly the worst path because it's so bad. It is quite bad, but you do gain some bonuses. But it's also quite terrible. It's really terrible when you take into consideration the direct rival of Britain is France, and their communist tree doesn't require you to completely destroy their empire. You still have the option to build up your industry, to core some of it, and everything like that. Well, you also gain a whole bunch of buffs. You get division attack, you get division defense, you get infinite manpower, and also research speed. You do gain some compliance gain, and you also gain a whole bunch of industry, essentially the same industrial bonuses, factory output, dockyard output, but also division attack and division defense and core territory. So it's just a little bit better. And it really and the the industrial bonuses you get from going with the communists is just much better. So I don't know, man, it's the worst path available, and that's all there is to it. So thanks for watching, Kings, and see you next time.